What's up, everybody? My name is Ryan Thomas. You are tuning into the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Spreaker.com, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and obviously GrandstandSportsNetwork.com. There's more than one way to tune into the show, for everyone that's wondering. So here I am, live on the podcast once again, and it just wrapped up part one of today's show. I talked about E.J. Gaines, the Buffalo Bills cornerback. Is he worth keeping? $7.5 to $10 million a season. My thoughts on that and much, much more. And in terms of the Buffalo Bills and keeping players and things of that nature, you can tune into that. And obviously, back again, and I want to talk about the man, the answer, Frankie, the answer, Edgar, a guy that I really want to preface all my statements by saying the true meaning of the title. The true meaning of the title, the Throwback Fighter. So I have been a mixed martial arts fan realistically since the beginning. Not since the beginning of, mixed martial arts. It was maybe the pay-per-views that were on, the UFC 1, UFC 2. That was, I was maybe a year or two old, not to date myself, but I just did. But since the beginning, I'd say since the Zuffa era, like Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz and Randy Couture and Ken Shamrock and all those guys, since the start of that, since the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, around that time was when I really started getting into it. My dad was always a huge fan, but I really didn't start getting into it until I really learned what it was, until I was of age to learn what it was, because it was so brutal, so violent. My parents didn't want me watching it, but my dad would always sneak the VHS tapes, put them in, and we'd be watching it, and then my mom would be like, what are you guys watching there? And he'd be like, oh, we're just watching boxing, and it wasn't boxing, it was UFC. And along the way, the UFC and MMA has changed so much. I would say it's changed so much in the last 3 to 5 years. That can be attributed to a lot of things. Could be the fact that WME-MIG bought the company a couple years ago for $4.2 billion. Could be the fact that the business of the UFC and the business of MMA has grown so predominantly pay-per-view that the UFC and Bellator need stars. They need stars to draw attention to their brand, and they need to put their stars in the forefront of the eye of the fans, in the eyes of the fans. So what I mean by that is there's 3 separate eras. There is I could say 4. There is the underground era, where it was just so violent, so brutal, the human cockfighting era, as John McCain referred to it. There is the Spike TV era that was ran pretty much by the Ultimate Fighter. Or I'll say there was the Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture era, and then there was the Spike Ultimate Fighter era, and then there was the true great pay-per-view era, which preceded itself by Pride Fighting Championships and the WEC World Extreme Cage Fighting, joining forces with the UFC, merging with the UFC, as well as Strikeforce shortly thereafter. And then we have the NFL of MMA, which is how we know it as the UFC, with these superstars, guys like Conor McGregor, previous superstars like Ronda Rousey, who's now in the WWE. We have seen it evolve in so many different ways, and along the way there are fighters mixed in there that are often forgotten about. They're often looked at as, well, those were the guys of the past, and most of them are guys of the past, whereas Frankie Edgar has transcended in his career. He has been a part of separate eras, and any fighter that has been a part of separate eras and is still as successful as they were when they started, guys like such as Frankie Edgar has been, you are in the not even in the greatest of all time conversation, because that's corny. That's something that we hear about all the time. You are in a unique bubble to be a guy that has transcended in all 3 eras of his career. He's been on Spike TV, he's been on Fox, he's headlined pay-per-views all around the world for the UFC. And he's a true throwback fighter. What I mean by that is some guys care more about the fancy suits and the watches and the money fights, whereas Frankie Edgar just wants to fight. He just wants to prove that he's the best in the world. And that has been lost in the sport of MMA. It was about being the best for such a long time. The titles actually mattered, whereas now rankings and title matchups are made due to the star power of one fighter or the other or both. And I think that is a shame. And I think Frankie Edgar doing what he has done in his career, and most recently accepting a fight with Brian Ortega when the UFC featherweight title holder Max Holloway had to pull out due to a leg injury. Edgar was slated to fight for the featherweight title. The UFC offers him the next man up, which is the third-ranked featherweight, and Brian Ortega. Edgar is the number 2-ranked featherweight. And Frankie Edgar just says, yeah, I guess that makes sense. That is pretty badass. That is awesome that Frankie Edgar actually has the cojones to say, I don't care what I have to lose. I don't care what people say. I am going to fight this man and prove that I'm the best contender in this division. And I think that was awesome. The fight moves from a 5-round title fight to a 3-round fight. That changes things a lot because I think Frankie Edgar is a guy that is very tough to finish, but Brian Ortega is a young gun. He has been dispatching of everyone that has faced him, including Cub Swanson, who Frankie Edgar also owns a win over as well. So, and Cub Swanson is no slouch. So all that being said, there are few fighters like Frankie who would have stood up and said, yeah, I'll take that. He has a lot to lose in this fight. He has an opportunity to lose everything. He has received multiple title shots in 2 divisions, being that he's a former UFC lightweight champion. He is a 2-time featherweight title contender, one for the lineal title, one for the interim title, due to the Conor McGregor situation. He's beaten the likes of Sean Shirk, Gray Maynard, BJ Penn 3 times. I thought both Benson Henderson fights were complete robberies in terms of the judging. I thought he won both of those fights. One of those was a unanimous decision loss. The other was a split decision loss. The Frankie Edgar fight with Jose Aldo, the first fight, that was close. Uriah Faber, Chad Mendes, he starched Chad Mendes, beat Jeremy Stevens and Yair Rodriguez. A true who's who of the UFC featherweight division. The only guy that he hasn't been able to get past is Jose Aldo. And I think it's a speed thing. I think it's a timing thing. Whereas Jose Aldo is a little bit bigger than Frankie, a little bit faster, and he hits a little bit harder. Frankie can't stick and move to his speed boxing techniques against a guy like Aldo because he's got the leg kicks. And I think that was a detriment to Edgar in both of those fights. But I did think the first one should have been a split at least. I thought one judge should have given it to Frankie at least out of the 3. But that's neither here nor there. The true crime of Edgar's career, in my opinion, were both fights versus Benson Henderson. I thought he won both of those fights. They're both title fights. One in which he was the champion and he lost his title, and then he gets an immediate rematch, and they give him a loss due to a split decision, and that was that. He moved down to 145. He's been a top contender ever since, one of the top 3 featherweights in the world. So I think that this guy belongs in the UFC Hall of Fame, and I think he will be. I think he'll be put in the UFC Hall of Fame. I think this guy belongs in the discussion as one of the true badasses of the UFC, and nobody talks about him. He's in a illustrious camp in terms of his fight team. He's got Eddie Alvarez, Marlon Moraes, Edson Barboza, and he's got one of the best minds in the game in Mark Henry, who's one of the best coaches in mixed martial arts today. And for those of you that have tuned into this podcast and have listened to my Bills stuff and, you're curious about my MMA stuff, there are fight teams within the sport. Guys train at one gym. They form teams. That way the fighters can hone their craft and become better because, as we all know, iron sharpens iron. And Frankie Edgar is trained with Eddie Alvarez. He's trained with Marlon Moraes, who's a former World Series of Fighting champion. And you have Edson Barboza, who's been one of the top lightweights in the world for the last, decade and a half. So I think that Edgar is one of the last of the Mohicans, a dying breed in the sport, and we need to enjoy him while we can. This fight is huge. This fight with Ortega is literally everything is on the line in Frankie Edgar's career. If he loses this fight, will he get a title shot again? I don't know. I really don't know. But this is a true testament to Frankie Edgar's heart, will, and determination to say, screw it. I haven't been paid in a minute. I want to fight, and I'm going to fight this guy, regardless of whether or not he's a young, up-and-coming prospect, whatever you want to call it. Brian Ortega is dangerous. Frankie Edgar is dangerous. But one thing is known. One thing should be known, I should say, about Frankie Edgar. He's never been finished. Never in his entire career via submission or knockout. And we know he's been close. The Frankie Edgar fight, the Frankie Edgar 2 fight, and the Frankie Edgar 3 fight, they fought 3 times. 2 of the greatest fights, easily in my top 5 in UFC history. And Frankie Edgar was a half of those fights. One of the fights, he fought to a draw, which was the second one, and then the other fight, the third fight, he knocks out Gray Maynard, Gray Maynard knocked him down 4 times in the first round of the second fight. And you wondered, how is this guy fighting? Not only how is he fighting, how is he winning? He made the fight a draw after a 10-8 first round. Truly remarkable. And that alone puts him in elite company in terms of the sports, in terms of the MMA, how the MMA fans will look at him once his career is over. And his career is almost over. I think he's got a lot left. Obviously, he's starching these young gun fighters like Yair Rodriguez and Jeremy Stevens. He's running through them, whitewashing them. So I think that Frankie Edgar definitely is a true champion. I mean, I'm very excited to see this fight, and I could bet either way. And if someone said either way, I think Ortega will win because he's got the better jiu-jitsu, or I think Frankie Edgar will win because he's tougher, he's the more durable fighter, he's the more experienced fighter. I wouldn't disagree with either one of those takes. I get it. I think that both of those takes are fair. I have to lean Edgar just because I admire him and he's one of my favorite fighters, but I could definitely see Brian Ortega winning this fight. I could definitely see him being the first man to finish Frankie Edgar. And with a win over Edgar, even on short notice, Ortega becomes a fighter that is fighting for the title, for the max. This is for the number 1 contender spot. This could have realistically been an interim title fight, but thank God it was not, because they've done too much of those. Far too many for my taste. But that's it. Frankie Edgar, one of the last of the Mohicans, a dying breed, a true throwback fighter. The throwback fighter. The throwback fighter. I don't care what anyone says. The dude fights whoever they put in front of him, willingly raises his hand in the worst of circumstances. He's fighting for the title. Think about mentally. Fighting for the title against Max Holloway, not once but twice. You get hurt the first time, he gets hurt the second time. The fight's been scrapped twice. And he says, screw it, I'll take on Brian Ortega. Amazing. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take. Take care.